Welcome all to this Team Society webinar. My name is Sarah Heidenreich and I'm a researcher at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Cultures at NTNU, and I'm supporting the coordination of the Team Society. For those of you who are new here today, just very briefly, what is Team Society? We are a team of social science and humanities researchers organized under NTNU Energy. We do basically two things. We have some research projects we do, and the other thing we do is to try to showcase and promote the diversity of social science and humanities research on energy and sustainability issues across NTNU. Today's presentation is about a green maritime shift, lessons from the electrification of ferries in Norway. And I'm very happy to have Simen Rostad Sæther as presenter today and Markus Steen as discussant. So I would like to give the word to Simen.
Yeah. There. Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is everything good? Yeah. Okay, so today I will present a paper that is co-authored with Professor Espen Moe at the Department of Sociology and Political Science at NTNU, together with me, Simen Rostad Sæther. I'm a Ph.D. student in political science. So this paper that Sarah told you about, it's called the Green Maritime Shift, Lesson from the Electrification of Norwegian Ferries. We have recently submitted this paper to Energy Research and Social Science and is currently under review. And it's one of the first attempts at studying the politically accelerated transition in the maritime sector. Quickly, we have gathered data through interviews and also focus groups, and also attended high-profile workshops and conferences. Additionally, we have looked at official documents, white papers, strategies, and so on, and media statements. So we have a good sort of cross-referencing material, which we have used as the case material. So a little bit of the theoretical backdrop. So Moe states that energy transitions can be defined as long-term fundamental structural changes in the energy system. And energy transition scholar Steen, he asserts that what they all have in common is that they have their long duration. The literature on these sort of political dynamics of the energy transition also suggests that these transitions are difficult and they're protracted. They're messy, conflictual, and highly disjointed. So we sort of base our theoretical backdrop on four different sort of theoretical backlash, and the first one is national systems of innovation, and I just move this there. So that's sort of the networks and institutions so I just have to fix my backup here. It's the networks and institutions of the private and public sectors that sort of where they interact and where they initiate, import, and also diffuse to new technologies. So what it tells us is that we can expect that structural change is more easily pursued in systems of innovations, which are characterized by networking, cooperation, and openness, and also where sort of the overarching principle is sort of knowledge sharing and collaboration over cutthroat competition. And secondly, we have sort of this Mazzucato light version where she sort of emphasizes that we have to go beyond system of innovations. She emphasizes the role of the state, and a central point being that sort of this state as merely a facilitator belongs to the past. Instead, she suggests that the state is a key partner with the private sector, and it sort of coordinates intra-industrial exchange and sort of intra-company and private public space, and it uses public procurement, for instance, and sort of takes risk more than sort of the private sector can do, and also it sort of shapes and creates new markets, and that's very important. So the third one is we back around on this sort of energy transitions. They do create winners and losers, and the losers are typically old incumbents. And the characteristic of that is that they had ample time to organize and to influence and lobby politicians. So the transition literature actually says or tells us that transitions routinely meet vested interest resistance. And finally, Akin and Upranen, they theorize that the current carbon lock-in is so prevalent that no change can happen unless there is some shock that sort of repoliticizes the field. And then finally, on sort of the more political science and sort of this political side of things, so Stokes and Breeds, they highlight that while many studies look at technical and the economic and the policy drivers, very little attention has actually been looked on sort of these political dynamics of the energy transition. And finally, even though sort of the current renewable transition is actively pursued by policymakers, the crucial issue of the politics surrounding their deliberate acceleration remains understudied. And this is sort of what we have as a backdrop here. So I will go through some of the key developments that has led to this electrification, the accelerated transition. And as you may know, Norway has the first electric ferry, and it's called the MF Ampere, and it had its maiden voyage in May of 2015. And it was a result of a competition that was posted by the Ministry of Transport in 2011, so quite a long time ago. And then it resulted in this developmental contract with Statens Vegvesen, the Norwegian Public Road Administration. And then a little bit simultaneously as this sort of maiden voyage and sort of the success of the Ampere ferry, you had the oil price crash in 2014 and beyond, which led to a lot of sort of considerable debate, and sort of a lot of the lobbying went into how do we sort of save, and how do we save the maritime sector, basically. And not to long story short, it ended up in support for this parliamentary ruling, which states that all new ferry tenders in Norway has to be low emission technologies if it's possible. And this sort of set the stage a bit, and also together with the success and the sort of this proof of concept that the MF Ampere gave us. So very quickly about the Norwegian ferry sector, in 2017 we had about 200 ferries with a very old fleet, accounting for about 13% of total emissions from shipping, and about 2.4% of total CO2 emissions from Norway, as well as being a very considerable source of local pollutions at ports. As of early 2021, we have 34 lanes, which are fully electric or hybrid electric with a considerable electrification rate. And we also now have one hydrogen ferry. I'm not sure if it's fully operational yet, but I think they're testing it right now. And then there is scheduled 57 lanes. And as you can see from the map, we tried to map this out. And of course, You can note in Nordland there is in 2024 there is one hydrogen. That's the longest. It's the one that goes from Bodø to Lofoten, which will be hydrogen. So that's cool. And the final here is that they were supposed, like the governmental goal, sort of the platform they had from the last election, said that they would like to, or they would try to provide low and zero emission solutions to all ferries between 2025. But this, like late last year, they changed this, or they pushed it upward to 2023. So we would probably expect that some of these rest of these lanes will also be pushed towards electrification. So we propose 4 main exploratory factors that has led to a rapid electrification of Norwegian ferries. So the first is what we label the Norwegian ferry innovation system. The second is the Norwegian entrepreneurial state. And thirdly, we find an absence of vested interests. And fourth, the oil price shock is an accelerator. So I'll go into more detail about those. So the first one is, like I said, what we label the ferry innovation system. And we assert that it has played a major role in creating the conditions and the environment where electrification could happen. And it frankly is because, there is a lot of dialogue between these things, and they together, they have sort of facilitated, they have engaged in dialogue, they have figured out what is needed, and they have worked, and they have like this good collaboration between them, state and both the private sector and the public sector. And it's also mobilized the supply chain because of this openness and sort of moving towards the same goal, and also overlapping and finding sort of the right solutions. So that is one very key condition that we find. The second is what we then call the Norwegian entrepreneurial state. And we assert that we find that the Norwegian state acted entrepreneurially, moving beyond merely being a de-risker, and actually played a very active and crucial role as market creator and transformer through various agencies, such as the Norwegian Public Road Administration and through the counties, and also all of the support schemes which have assisted and sort of worked together, mobilizing. And then we also find that we show that the market mechanisms alone would never have yielded as fast a transition, simply because it would have taken much longer, because there weren't any electrification options on the table. So, and we also find that the state sort of involved itself by ticking several boxes. So what I alluded to earlier, they focus on sort of this overarching sort of strategy of creating sort of battery, and also the greening of the maritime sector, the Norwegian maritime sector, which is huge. So they sort of benefited both the climate and potentially also creating growth clusters and industry. And then thirdly, we find that the absence of vested interests resistance in the maritime side made it easier to pursue politics of structural change and find win-win solutions. In fact, to the extent that the vested interests played a role, they actually actively pushed the states to provide them conditions and incentivize electrification and low emission technology, which is historically quite the opposite of what has happened before. So instead of fear of losing out because of electrification, the sector actually saw it perhaps as an inevitable change and tried to position themselves to benefit from it. And finally, so the relative absence of vested interests interplayed with the occurrence of this strong oil shock in 2020, 14, 15, and 16, which created a further incentive for a maritime sector that was deeply dependent on orders from the petroleum sector to find new markets and products. And in many ways, ferries became one of the new sort of lifelines for the industry. So that's, I will just have to get my notes here. So what we have done in the paper is that we have made 6 success criteria for the transition, and I will try to sort of briefly go through them. And the first one that we was highlighted extensively throughout this process is that the extensive dialogue between the actors in the innovation system has been hailed as both a success, and also it's one of the most important things, that this dialogue between the actors is extremely important. Secondly, we have an innovation system in Norway that is characterized by close collaboration and that of an absence of opposing vested interests. And the stakeholders in the ferries segment, and by extension the maritime sector in Norway, is fairly small and manageable. And they're also part of large clusters. And we have sort of one line that has been sort of repeated in different sort of ways, is that the Norwegian actors, or the actors in the maritime sector, they collaborate when they can, and they compete only when they have to. And this sort of both creates this unique environment where you're sort of pulling in the same directions, and you're inventing and you're refining your system, and you want to succeed, and you succeed together. And sort of this focus on developing those competitive national supply chains probably created some of these sort of would-be transition losers into what we could call convertibles, or maybe even winners in the transition. So that has been very important. And we think that that is a success criteria. And then thirdly, an interconnected system and an active state. So the range of support schemes and the process knowledge that a lot of these programs have facilitated a lot of this sharing between actors in the system, and that has helped tremendously. And they also have created strong incentives to collaborate. And it's also true that Enova has sort of had this, like I told a little bit about earlier, they had this focus on market transformation goals, which sort of led into this focus on supply chains, which has been very important. And it's sort of connected into this national competitive advantage that Norway has with the renewable energy and the process knowledge we have for manufacture and both in the mineral space, so like the battery technologies and so on. And they actually, we have 2 battery factories already in Norway, which focus on the maritime industry, Corvus in Bergen and Siemens here in Trondheim. So these are at least partly a result of our focus to be front runners here. So fourthly, the Norwegian entrepreneurial state. So they sort of pulled together in the same direction, which made it possible for local and regional policymakers to be more ambitious, and because you had that sort of overlay in the system, and sort of this de-risking factor of the national public road administration really did help to focus sort of on a lot of the upfront cost, and also the focus on getting what we could call sort of this transition enabling infrastructure, which charging for these ferries didn't happen by itself, and the Norwegian public sector has been very crucial in enabling that, which then led to this focus on procurement and ambitious climate targets really did set the direction for the ferry sector. And then finally, we making the best out of a crisis. So the stakeholder really did use this window of opportunity that the oil price crash created to sort of position both the support system and also the industries to be more competitive in a new environment, which we are seeing now is yearning for sort of this low zero emission technologies. So it is very key to getting that over the line. So we do have some conclusions. So of course, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that a lot of our findings are undoubtedly case specific to Norway. And there are, of course, good reasons why Norway would be expected to be a front runner in exactly this area. We have a strong tradition in the maritime sector, and it's really something that made sense for that. So beside having a well-functioning innovation system and a state that actively facilitated structural change, one of the lessons is, like I alluded to earlier, is that to find sort of these national competitive advantages in the energy transition is increasingly important as policymaker and public support system allocate scarcer resources in their attempt to identify sustainable growth impulses. We thus believe that this case holds some important lessons in terms of the interaction between the public and the private sector, and ultimately in terms of how transition, even in hard to decarbonize sector as the maritime sector is, can be politically accelerated. So linking sort of the green maritime shift to national chains of suppliers and battery producers has, in this case, aligned climate and industrial policy goals. This has indeed accelerated the process of change. And other countries and regions might have different competitive industries, sectors, and niches that are conducive to an energy transition. And this case shows how Norway did it with its ferries. Thank you.
Thank you, Simen, for this really great presentation of what so far sounds like a quite successful story. Let's see how we think after the discussion. I would now like to give the word to our discussant, Markus Steen, before then opening for a more general discussion afterwards.
All right, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Simen, for a very interesting presentation. And I also had the chance to read the paper, so my comments are based on that also. And to provide just a little bit of context, so I'm working in SINTEF, and for the last 5-6 years, a lot of my research time has been devoted to studying this transition process in the shipping sector, especially coastal shipping in Norway and also the port sector. So we've been doing that in the Green Fleet project and in a project called Trasepo, and also working on sort of maritime sector transitions in FME Entrance and also other projects. So I think I just wanted to say this beforehand because I'm quite familiar with the case, and I also work a lot with with transition theory. I guess if I didn't have this kind of background knowledge, my comments, I think, would be quite different. So while I agree this is a success story, it's a very interesting case of how policy can play a role in transitions. I have to say that there are things here that I'm quite critical to. In terms of in terms of both your framework and your findings, actually. So take it as that. So this is coming from a critical friend. So my comments are, I'm acting the reviewer now in energy research and social science. And so to begin in mind, I have quite a lot of notes and they're a bit sort of all over the place, and I added more when you spoke now. So, but I'll try to bring some coherence into this. So, just to begin with, I think there's a need for a much more thorough literature review. So you make the statement that there is a lack of research on the maritime sector, there is a lack of research on the politics of transitions. So I can mention at least, I think, 8 or 10 relevant papers and reports dealing with directly or indirectly with this case and about electrification of maritime shipping in Norway. So some of that is coming from the work that we did in the Greenfield project. But there's also other work. So my colleague here at SINTEF, Kristinus Markbjerkan, and colleagues in FME Moses wrote about the procurement contracts and the role of that for these changes that we're seeing in ferries. There's also this, I think, quite important paper for you, which is Svein Gunnar Sjøtun's paper on Ampere as a pilot and demonstration project, which Ampere had really nothing to do with Pilot E, which I think you write in the paper. So those are separate things. But anyways, I think that Sjøtun paper is quite important. There's also work by which Svein Gunnar Sjøtun also was involved in with Rune Njøs and others at Høgskolen på Vestlandet, which is a different name now. Sorry, I can't remember. But anyways, they have a paper published last year that looked into the sort of the cluster in the western part of Norway around the maritime sector also, which I think is relevant. So there's that sort of the transition work on, and there's obviously more, so let's say social science work on sustainability transitions within shipping. There's not a lot, but there is some, and I think you need to look into that. And then second, I think this is really about the politics of transitions, and I think there were things there I was kind of expecting. So, for instance, the work by Meadowcraft, there are a few references, but there are more recent references I think that are important. I also think that there's lots of work now on the Energiewende as an example of politics in accelerating transitions, obviously on a much bigger scale in a sense, but there is more there, and I think you need to showcase that. I think also you should look at the work by Håkon Normann on the politics of transitions and on policy networks. And this, I think, has quite a bit to do with, I think your paper would benefit from being more focused on the politics. So I'm also a bit kind of, I'm an economic geographer as a background and working in also a lot with sort of innovation studies, which is sort of integral or part of sustainability transitions, or well, that you could frame that in different ways. But anyway, so the innovation system literature, I'm not really sure how very useful it is here. Sort of, and I'm not sure I would agree that you can call something a ferry innovation system, or you can set that kind of boundary. But I think that one of the key things here is that there's this maritime sort of national level innovation system. Lots of people have also written about that, but and I think it's getting also then to what the sort of the incumbents and what the different actors here are. There are very few, say, actors on the whole supply side of the maritime sector. So one thing is the shipping companies. So the ferry operators, they have the ferries, and that's sort of it, mostly. Some of them have other stuff also. But if you look at the supply side, most of the shipyards and all the technology developers and suppliers and so on, they sell not only to the ferry sector, but to many different market segments within shipping, right? So obviously there's an interest there in something novel occurring, right? So there's something about this kind of what were really the preconditions that enabled also policy to play this kind of role. There's that window of opportunity opening up, and there's something there which I also find a little bit lacking in the paper. And it's about really understanding the climate policy goals and how those are at the national level and how they're being taken up by Statens vegvesen or the Norwegian Public Roads Administration that you refer to in the paper, how they also trickle down to the regional level. So you find regions like Vestland and some of that have been sort of very proactive here. They set very high emission reduction goals, right? And how can a county, so if you look at what these counties, what are their emissions? What are they responsible for, and what can they do about it? The sort of ferries, and especially fast ferries, they represent a huge chunk of that. So it's kind of, this is where we need to act from the policymaker side of the table if we are to meet our climate goals. So there's that. Really, I think that's important, and it hasn't been spelled out as part of your story. And I also think there's another part of this story, which is that over the last, I don't know, let's say 5-10 years, or let's say last 5 years and coming 5 years, there's this period now where lots of ferries needed to be replaced anyways because they were old. So there's that window of opportunity there of building new and buying new or retrofitting existing ferries. So that window of opportunity was kind of supported by that. And then I think there's something about the way that you frame or tell the story about the sort of the industry and the cluster. And I think I wouldn't say that this should be seen as a creative destruction in a sense. There's no big disruption really, and for the suppliers not. And why is that? Well, it's because we're not talking about their entire market being changed overnight. So, and hybridization suggests that the internal combustion engine will still be around for a long time, right? So there's something about this, most of all, being a welcome opportunity for some of the globally leading maritime suppliers, right? And some of them already have some experience with batteries and electrification because of research projects and pilot projects that came before Ampere. So this started earlier. So I think it's kind of, and then there's that kind of the way that the framing of incumbents, this is, opinions differ here, but I think that looking at the transition literature, a lot of especially the early work and the way that one discussed and talked about the role of incumbents was very much based on, I would say, a quite limited understanding of incumbents. So the typical incumbent would be the large power company, the large oil producer or whatever, right? And obviously they have strong vested interests and they often want to keep things stable. But I think some of the sort of quite interesting incumbents looking at the maritime sector in Norway are the big supplier companies like Siemens or Wärtsilä or ABB and Rolls-Royce and all of those. And they've been very sort of welcoming to all these changes because they can play this role and they can provide and they can bring along expertise from other markets that they serve. So there's something there which, yeah. So, yeah, and I think so. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but so there's the kind of the story of how procurement is really interesting here, and how the NPRA, so Statens vegvesen, used procurement. I think it's kind of, I remember I've actually interviewed, they're also part of our Green Fleet project. And they've been sort of I was struck by how they talked about really seeing their role through these development contracts of doing many things. So obviously the main thing is that the ferry operates regularly and it's safe and all that. But they also sort of very, very vocal on saying that, we actually see this as an opportunity for us to contribute to innovation and to the development of the maritime sector. And there's a history there also because they used the same kind of thinking and the same kind of instruments were used for LNG. Well, when LNG was introduced 20 years ago now. So there's that kind of history there that maybe, I don't know if you need to include it, but it's kind of interesting to be aware of. Yeah, so I think I'm not going to go on forever, but if I were the reviewer or one of the reviewers, which I'm not, I would probably recommend you to focus more. And I think I'd suggest to focus more on the politics here, and sort of what enabled that kind of policy and that kind of political practice. And I think that can be explained by some of the elements that you have in the story. So about the sort of innovative industry, but there are some other elements there, which is about this need for replacement, and crucially, I think, the climate policy goal setting at both national and regional level, and how that results in these procurement practices. And then there's one final point, which is which I didn't really find here, and that is that there's because you also talk about sort of the value chain and so on, and then I didn't really understand what you meant if you were talking about the value chain that delivers ships, because I think at least what we observed, one of the major changes with electrification, and one of the major challenges is that the value chain is reconfigured, it's changed, because shipping connects now with the power sector, and there's that need for charging and grid development and so on. And that is a major challenge. And it's a reason in some cases why electrification isn't something that all counties jump onto, because they don't have that grid infrastructure in place, and it would require a lot of investment to get that in place. Yeah, and so, yeah, I think maybe I'll end there. So I hope this didn't come across as overly critical. So it's a fascinating story, I think, but I think you need to sharpen it a bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Markus, for some great comments. Simen, would you like to reply to some of it? I don't think we have the time to go into really everything, but
first and foremost, thank you for excellent review. I can almost call it that. It's very fascinating to hear. And I think that's definitely, I would like you to send me what you have written so we can go through it a bit more with Espen as well. And I think it's definitely the case that we have, it's sort of, it's a limited amount, and we cut a lot. I think we had, I don't know, Espen, maybe 16,000 words when we finished our draft. So it's already been cut a lot, and I think, I mean, like you alluded to, I think that there is obviously things written about this, but very little has been written from a social science perspective, and sort of. But I suppose we also got a bit dragged towards the other side as well, which I think which is kind of a little bit of your point, that we might have focused more on the political side, and sort of like double down a bit on that side and leave the rest to sort of to that is has been done already. And I think again, I can't really go through everything you said now, but I think it's duly noted. But I think also sort of the supply chain question is also it's also something that came up a lot in our interviews, is that sort of this Norway has a very strong maritime presence, and sort of this connection, as you pointed out, this together with the renewable energy sector we have in Norway, and this combination between sort of system integrators like Siemens, and how they have decided to place their battery factories here, which is, at least that's what our respondents tell us, that might have not happened, that they put them here, if we didn't have a very aggressive focus on putting batteries in all types of ships. But I think that's a valid point that I think we could highlight more. And I think I sort of, it's not like the shipyards survived because of the ferries, but it was one of the legs that they got, and it wasn't lucrative for them at all. And some of them actually lost quite a lot of money, but it sort of also put them up to this sort of low emission capacity, or like that sort of in-house knowledge, and which we, that's a little bit of the problem now, is that we're losing that overseas now. And that is, again, this new round, with Corona now and the pandemic, we're losing it to Turkish shipyards, and we have done so for a while. And you see now this sort of kind of like the same political coalition, almost sort of saying that, we spent all this money on getting sort of, building that capacity, and now we're losing it overseas, and we have to sort of make sure that ships are built in Norway, because allegedly, that without a home market, it's going to be difficult to also develop. Yeah, that's sort of like a little bit, but I would very much like you to send us your comments, and I think there will definitely be one more round, or maybe two even, with this paper. I'm also finishing my PhD, so it's good to have sent, to have one under the belt. So I think it's, I thank you for. I would love to talk more with you about this stuff. I think it's good to have someone that also knows. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.